Then if we look at illegal fishing, the extended reach of commercial fishing vessels, the lack of maritime surveillance and enforcement in some of the vast ocean areas and on the high seas have led to increased illegal, unregulated fishing and unreported fishing. Corruption in licensing and access to fisheries, as well as a lack of port state controls and trade certification measures for catches, have led to increased unloading and trade in illegally caught fish in the region. In the Indian Ocean, a significant amount of fisheries catches qualify as illegal, unreported and unregulated. 18% in the Western Indian Ocean and 32% in the Eastern Indian Ocean. There's often a nexus as well between different forms of transnational crime, for instance, between piracy and fishing, illegal fishing. So what is the role of maritime forces in combating transnational crime? The ability to deal with transnational crime in the Indian Ocean depends on effective law enforcement and criminal justice infrastructure, as well as cooperation and coordination between maritime forces and civilian agencies. And here I tie into the theme of this conference, the integration of civilian and military forces in securing maritime security nationally, regionally and globally. Navies and coast guards, together with their counterparts in the police and customs organisations, have traditionally been involved in fisheries, customs, quarantine and immigration law enforcement in marine areas both within and increasingly beyond national jurisdiction, so beyond the 200 nautical mile limit. The rising incidence of criminal activity at sea and future threats to the region's energy and resources calls for an increasing focus on strengthening our legal and institutional framework for cooperative maritime surveillance and enforcement across national boundaries and on the high seas. So we need to move from thinking nationally to regionally and globally. If we look at our legal basis, for instance, for combating piracy, there are several articles in the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention which are fundamental to the customary international law code for combating piracy. But with the upsurge of piracy off Somalia, we definitely found that these were inadequate and you needed other forms of cooperation. So you have the Djibouti Code of Conduct, for instance, sponsored by the International Maritime Organization, which brought together the nations of the Western Indian Ocean to combat piracy and take some robust measures against what was happening off the Horn of Africa. We also needed to develop transfer agreements between regional states so that if pirates were apprehended, they could then be accepted for investigation and prosecution by the regional countries. Those bilateral agreements were not in place in 2008, and so they've developed since 2008 a network of countries, particularly Kenya, Mauritius, the Seychelles and Tanzania have become involved in accepting pirates for prosecution. And then, of course, the UN has contributed, and extra-regional partners have been called into play through the UN Office of Drugs and Crime Counter-Piracy Program. So an intensive international effort ensued starting in 2008 to combat the upsurge in piracy in this region, and it significantly diminished this threat. So it's been a real success story for this region. Multi-dimensional strategies have been required to tackle this complex regional and global problem. The United Nations responses through the Security Council and the specialised agency UNODC, the naval responses, almost all the navies of the world were involved in combating this crime. Shipping industry responses, particularly sponsored by the IMO and the best management practices, criminal justice responses required from all the countries in the region and even extra-regionally, and regional capacity building across the board to combat this form of transnational crime. So we see a series of UN Security Council resolutions, NATO Operation Allied Shield and others before it, CTG 151, the EU NAVFOR Operation Atalanta, and the counter-piracy operations by individual navies. Djibouti Code of Conduct, the UN ODC counter-piracy program, and the BMP for the shipping industry. The current global and regional responses predominantly address the symptoms of piracy rather than its root causes. I think you will all acknowledge that the root causes lie on land, lawlessness on land, poverty, and lack of strong governance systems. Restoration of the rule of law and stable political governance in Somalia would be an ultimate solution, but one very difficult to obtain. Investigation and prosecution of pirates still depends on applicable provisions in domestic law and political will to exercise jurisdiction. So ongoing cooperation is needed between regional states to investigate and prosecute piracy offences and to defeat the operations of organised crime networks. And this requires ongoing cooperation and vigilance against this threat. If we look at the counter-piracy program in the region, it works in 6 countries in the Somali Basin: Somalia, Kenya, Seychelles, Mauritius, Tanzania, and the Maldives. Support for fair and efficient trials and humane and secure imprisonment has been achieved. Judicial, prosecutorial, and police capacity building programs have also resulted from this program. And very practical things like the building of prisons to house not only pirates but other prisoners, the supply of office equipment, law texts, and Coast Guard equipment. If we look at people smuggling, we have a 2001 protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air. In that protocol, it enjoins states to cooperate to the fullest extent to prevent and suppress the smuggling of migrants by sea in accordance with the international law of the sea. And there is a particular article on cooperation at sea in relation to boarding and informing the flag state of boarding where that occurs. The protocol is implemented in our region through what's known as the Bali process on people smuggling, trafficking in persons, and related transnational crime, involving over 46 countries in the region. Australia and Sri Lanka, for instance, cooperate closely on counter people smuggling through the Australia-Sri Lanka Joint Working Group on people smuggling. And in 2014, Australia donated 2 Bay-class vessels to Sri Lanka to operate alongside the Sri Lankan Navy's existing capability to intercept people smuggling ventures originating in Sri Lankan waters. The vessels were gifted for the purpose of border protection, maritime safety, and to counter people smuggling. Under the Australia-Sri Lanka MOU concerning legal cooperation against the smuggling of migrants, both countries are working to strengthen people smuggling legislation to prevent criminals exploiting gaps in legal frameworks, of which there are many. So this, again, needs to be an ongoing effort, but it can be seen as somewhat of a success story in combating people smuggling in the region. If we look at illegal fishing, then there is a lot in the Law of the Sea Convention on illegal fishing, both within national jurisdiction and beyond, in Parts 5 and 7. We have a 1995 UN Fish Stocks Agreement for highly migratory and straddling stocks beyond national jurisdiction. And we have UN General Assembly resolutions, a series of them, on the destructive fisheries practice of deep-sea bottom trawling. Then in 2009, the Food and Agricultural Organisation negotiated and passed the Deep Sea Fisheries Guidelines, which look at very vulnerable marine ecosystems which may be impacted by fisheries practices such as bottom trawling. And it's the regional fisheries management organisations that are tasked with implementing all of this international law framework, both at the global and regional level. And in this region, we have the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission for the highly migratory species of tuna and the South Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement, as well as accompanying fisheries industry bodies. Part 5 of the Law of the Sea Convention provides a strong foundation for the enforcement of coastal state laws on resource exploitation and protection and preservation of the marine environment